Ladies and gentlemen, independent Americans around the country, around the world, especially inside Ukraine, and for everyone around the world tracking on Ukraine, we're continuing our unique and deep focus on everything happening in the war. And I want to continue to bring you real, powerful, insightful, experienced voices. And we've got a real opportunity here that I'm grateful for to speak to a man who's on the ground, a real fantastic reporter, also kind of an international man of mystery, just a fascinating guy. But the great and powerful Seth Harp joins us on Independent Americans. Welcome, Seth. Great to have you here.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks for having me.
So I said international man of mystery because you've traveled to many conflict zones around the world. You're an Iraq vet yourself. I want to get into that. You're there now, and I'm grateful for you making the time to squeeze us in. I want to start by asking you, Seth, the question I ask everybody: where are you, and how are you?
I'm doing well. I'm in Kiev, Ukraine. I'm a little bit sleep deprived and a little bit cold, but other than that, I'm doing well.
So, can you talk about you grew up in Texas, right?
Yeah, I'm from Texas, Austin,
And
Texas.
you're there now doing an investigative work for Harper's. But before you went to journalism school, you were in the Army. Can you explain, folks, what you did in the Army and when that was?
Definitely wasn't like a Navy SEAL, that's for sure. Green Beret, nothing like that. I was just in the Army Reserves when I was in college. I got called up for a tour in Iraq from '03 to '05, and I was basically just a truck driver that got shot at. But I was really young at that time, like 19, so it was a pretty formative experience. And ever since then, I've reported on, either the military or armed conflict or organized crime, things of that nature at that intersection, I would say.
And you've been Colombia, Syria, Iraq, all kinds of other places. Can you give me? Tell us how long you've been there, and why you wanted to go.
I've been in Kiev, or excuse me, I've been in Ukraine since maybe March 15th, I think. No, excuse me, March 18th. Why I wanted to go? Well, it's a huge, huge event. A war of this scale in Europe is something that hasn't been seen for a while. Definitely can't say I was prepared for it. Not an expert on Eastern Europe, not an expert on Russia by any means. But I do have a lot of experience working in combat zones as a reporter, so I couldn't sit it out.
So you get the assignment, or you arrange the assignment. You go into Kiev really at the start of this. You've been there now for I think we're into like our 41st day of the war. We talked to Quan Nguyen, who was in Kiev. We talked to Matt Gallagher when he had just left
Mm-hmm.
Lviv.
Mm-hmm.
Part of why I want to talk to you is because you have this unique perspective. You've been on all sides of this. You've been a 19-year-old in combat, and now you're covering 19-year-olds in combat on the
Mm-hmm.
Ukrainian and on the Russian side. Can you just give me,
Mm-hmm.
your impressions of what you're seeing now? Like, we see the headlines, we see the tweets. There's been some really great reporting from
Mm-hmm.
Ukrainian independent reporters, especially. But set up what you're seeing and maybe how you'd initially compare it to some of the other places you've been.
Right at this moment, I'm in a hotel in downtown Kiev, and the mood is a lot better than it has been for the past, I would say, week or few weeks. It's now pretty clear or definite that the Russians have fallen back from the suburbs of Kiev. So just on like a personal safety level, it feels a lot better. There's a lot less shelling audible on the outskirts of the city. And when I first arrived here, it was pretty bleak. I mean, the checkpoints were really hardcore. I mean, just every 100 meters, you have to go through a really fortified checkpoint where they're checking. There's a lot of Russian spies in the city, a lot of saboteurs. So they're checking. It doesn't matter if you're with territorial defense. It doesn't matter what your credentials are. They're looking at not just your ID, but like every page of your passport to make sure there's no Russian stamps in there. And that's kind of alleviated in the last few days as the territorial defense and the Ukrainian army have ventured farther out into the suburbs and recaptured a lot of these cities that the Russians had taken in their initial assault on Kiev. So among the people, like I think there's a really high sense of morale among the armed forces as well. So things are, at least in the city of Kiev, that things are looking up for the moment.
I don't know how much you saw of the Russians in Syria or in other places, but can you give us your assessment? You've been also outside the city. I see on your social you've been going out and talking to people, and I want to dig deeper into that. But can you kind of compare maybe the scope of what you've seen? You were in Iraq in the early days. You were in Syria. Can you compare the scope of what you're seeing in Ukraine so far to any other places you've been, Seth?
The only thing I think is comparable is the 2003 invasion of Iraq by the United States. I think that's a really good comparison in terms of like the scale, and the composition of the military units and everything that's going on. Syria is a little bit different. I didn't get into Syria until like 2016. I did see, I was in a position to observe parts of the Russian intervention there. One thing I might note is that the Russians really intervened in a successful way in Syria, to prop up the Assad regime at a time when it seemed like the regime could fall. Um, they were extremely brutal in their tactics, especially the bombing of Aleppo was probably the worst thing I saw in Syria. And we saw a lot of images of like Russian special forces operating in Syria, and they looked highly competent. And all that, I think, fed into the perception of Russian military confidence and might that is now sort of being punctured as we see that they launched this full scale assault on Kiev. It was really shocking. The U.S. intelligence agencies have predicted it, but there was a lot of skepticism about those claims. I personally was skeptical about it. And to see them attempt that and fail at it is really momentous. I think that the battle to defend Kiev, the defense of Kiev, will be remembered for a long time as a historic underdog victory. And it's a classic illustration of an old military principle, which is that it's a lot easier to defend a place than to attack.
Mm. So you said that you were a truck driver, during the invasion of Iraq, right? You were, a lowly, enlisted 19-year-old. Now you're seeing the other side of it. You're seeing Russians, like in pretty much a similar role, like conscripts, young soldiers who are driving trucks and getting blown up. Can you talk about, your social media feed has been really insightful for me, especially because of your personal vantage point and your personal experience. Can you talk about what you're seeing out there and what you think the American public maybe isn't seeing or appreciating?
Uh, your guest, Chris Fussell, am I saying that right?
Yep.
Fussell. He made a great point. You guys are having a great discussion on your last episode about, making a comparison between javelins and in-laws and anti-tank missiles and IEDs in the Iraq War. I think that's a really valid comparison. During the Iraq War, there wasn't a lot you could do about IEDs. They killed a lot of U.S. soldiers. Iranian intelligence, I think, basically got everything they wanted out of that conflict, and by providing shaped charges and more sophisticated IEDs to the Iraqi insurgency than they otherwise would have been able to devise on their own. And they blew up a lot of shit. They blew up and they killed a lot of U.S. soldiers, and the U.S. is pretty powerless to do much about it. I mean, they tried things like jamming, the signals of them or whatever, but we were pretty exposed. And in the end, the U.S. Forces ended up just falling back into their bases and couldn't really venture out into the country. And that's the situation as the conflict wound down into what was widely perceived as U.S. loss. And I think that you're seeing a lot of the same dynamic here, not with IEDs, but with these javelins and in-laws. And because of outdated Russian reliance on armor formations, especially in like suburban areas that they're driving in where there's a lot of cover for infantry and scout patrols that are armed with these things. I read that the U.S. had given about half of the whole supply of javelins to the Ukrainians. I don't know how many that is, but probably a lot. And they are just absolutely wrecking shit with that. I mean, I was out in a suburb of Kiev the other day called Zabuchia. I'm sorry, the pronunciation is Ukrainian. It's very difficult language, but Zabuchia, I think is the name of it. Very close to Irpin, with a stone's throw from Irpin. And on a stretch of the road there, we saw 13 tanks and APCs all bunched up, like within a quarter-mile stretch. They had all been totally destroyed. And all of them, I noticed, had their turrets like popped off, like the lids were popped off and they were like laying a distance away. So I don't know what happened there. The Ukrainians are very tightly control information, something else we could talk about. But yeah, it looked to me like the destruction that would be caused by in-laws, like they just got snuck up on. But why there were so many tanks and APCs in that small area and why they were so exposed and bunched up, it's just disastrous tactics. And they were not even able, I mean, they weren't able to evacuate all of their dead. I mean, we saw like dead Russian soldiers laying all over the place. It was pretty gruesome. And so, yeah, I think that's exposed a huge vulnerability, in the Russians. So, that's one point of comparison that I can draw.
Is there any way for you, Seth, to evaluate not just the strategic and tactical impact, but the morale impact? I think this is really something I pulled apart a bit with Seth and with Fussell, and I think I want to pull apart with you, Seth. IED scared the shit out of us, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
and for folks that don't know, they could be made with a garage door opener and,
Mm-hmm.
and some explosive artillery shells or anything. And then they evolved to these penetrating rounds that came in from Iran, but they scared folks, right? You were more likely to die from an IED than pretty much anything else, right? It was more dangerous to drive than to fly. Is there any way for you to gauge? I don't know if you've talked to any captured Russians or even talking to Ukrainian soldiers. I've been in the last episode. I talked about Saint Javelin. I feel like
Mm-hmm.
the American public isn't fully appreciating how scary these things are for someone
Yeah.
who's a 19-year-old tanker who's rolling through a convoy and just watches the tank in front of him and behind him get incinerated.
Yeah.
Do you have any sense for that and just how much it's impacting Russian morale?
I can only imagine that it's bad for the morale. We've heard reports of Russian soldiers deserting. Sometimes the Ministry of Defense will parade out some captives, and journalists can talk to them, but there's really not much that can be gleaned there. The Russians are kind of a black box in what exactly they're thinking. I can tell you that the Ukrainians, everyday Ukrainians, military, militia guys, because everyone here is in one way or the other, like in the military now. If not in a military capacity, in some kind of volunteer capacity, the society is very mobilized, and they're feeling very confident. And I think that the javelins, like you said, Saint Javelin, that's what they're all talking about. Everyone loves the in-laws. I think more so they talk more about in-laws than javelins. And also there's these drones that they have from Turkey called Bakhtiar or something, have been proven very effective. So I think it's been very good for their morale for sure.
Can you talk about over the course of the month, Seth? What is your day to day like? You're kind of going out and looking for stories. Are you working with stringers? How do you cover this right now? Where from the outside it may seem like there are journalists everywhere, and maybe that's because everybody has a cell phone right now. But how does a guy like you come into a place like this and cover this?
Um, well, the border's open. It's a lot easier to get into Ukraine than it was to get into Syria. Um, it kind of leads me to a point I was making a moment ago that information is very tightly controlled. I don't think we've seen any independent reporting from the front lines where they're actually fighting. You see a lot of videos that are created by soldiers, that are posted by soldiers, but even those I think are monitored by the SBU, by military intelligence, that to a way that we're not really familiar with coming from a U.S. military perspective. The military intelligence here really is superior to the military. I don't know exactly how it works bureaucratically, but they definitely have veto power over what gets out. I was just talking to the commander of the Georgian Foreign Legion the other day, Mamuka Mamulashvili, and he was complaining about how the SBU keeps editing his TikTok videos,
Really?
only letting him publish like short clips of it. So and a lot of it is coming through centralized channels. A lot of the reporting is coming through centralized channels. Like you have to get accredited with the military, and then they'll provide you. They encourage you to stay in their hotels, and then they'll provide you with fixers and translators. I've kind of done it independently. I stay in my own hotel, get my own translators, my own fixers. But nevertheless, I think there's a high degree of centralization of information, and that's where a lot of the reporting is coming from. And a lot of the reporting I've done has been kind of like on the side. And to answer your question, how is it done? I don't know. You just meet one guy, and it leads to another, to another, to another. And my basic principle is just to never say no to an interview.
Hmm.
And it oftentimes, it pays off, and they'll mention that someone else that they know, you can talk to this other person, they'll talk to you. And so you just string one connection to another and keep going.
I'm really glad you boiled that down, Seth, because I don't think maybe the average social media user, the average civilian appreciates how good the Ukrainians have been at the messaging control. I
Oh
mean,
yeah.
we're just instinctively retweeting things. We don't really know where they're coming from. You think it's a government site or it's an independent Ukrainian journalist, and it has this life, right? And I think it's been masterful in the way the Ukrainian government has centralized their communications, and they're winning the messaging war, maybe even more than they're winning the tactical war on the ground. And it's through that control, right? And at the same time, the American military is not allowing guys like you to embed with our forces that are in NATO. And you're, it sounds like they're not even really letting American journalists truly embed. Like, you get to set up interviews, you get this stuff fed to you, but I haven't seen too many independent American journalists who are just roaming around with Ukrainian units on the front lines, right?
No, you can't do that. They
Yeah,
won't allow that. Yeah, I don't know what
absolutely.
you would see if you could embed with the 82nd Airborne guys over in Poland. I mean, they're not really they're just kind of sitting around.
Yeah, yeah, but
Yeah,
I think the question has been, shouldn't we be able to, right? Like, I think, and that, especially in Iraq and Afghanistan, other places where it seemed like that was allowed. And I think especially for a guy like you or someone like Matt Gallagher that has that perspective, I think it could be so insightful. Yeah, maybe they're sitting around, but I also think that their families have a right to know if that's what they're doing. They're just sitting around, right?
mm-hmm.
Can
Yeah,
you
not totally agree.
can
Yeah.
you talk about your writing is really powerful because it has so much detail and humanity to it. What's this like for you personally, man? Like, we're talking, before we started, I asked you how many jewels you're smoking. When I was in Iraq, I smoked a pack a day, right? And my guys used to say you could tell how intense it was going to be by how many cigarettes I smoked. Can you talk
Yeah.
about, a guy like you? You're an investigative journalist now with Harper's, but you've written for Rolling Stone and others. Do you have any like life insurance? If you get killed over there, if you get wounded over there, what happens to a guy like you? Because I really think that part of it is underreported too.
Uh, Now you're making me paranoid. I don't have any life insurance. I never thought about that. I like it's not a healthy lifestyle. That's for sure. It's not safe. I mean, journalists have gotten killed like once a week since I've been here. Sadly, um, but you're so busy, doing reporting that I really don't think about it. Like, that's the main thing. I'm just constantly busy all day, just running from one place to another and interviewing people. There's a lot of stuff to be done. There's a lot of stuff to report on. You got to say no to a lot of things, unfortunately. Is that the food supply is not great. Like, all the stores in Kiev are completely closed. Oh, well, there's a few grocery stores that are open. So I've been eating just like salami and pretzels and oranges and apples when I can get them. But like losing weight, and yeah, definitely vaping too much. It always relapse every time I come to a war zone.
I think
So,
I appreciate you sharing that because I think the heart in what you're doing comes through, and I honestly think that's part of what America is tuning out too much is it's easy to gloss over and forget the humanity of this. And I think the Ukrainians are trying to scream out for that. And unfortunately, Americans sometimes need to hear it through American eyes or American voices to be able to fully appreciate it. Can you talk about? You mentioned you were out with the Azov unit recently. Can you talk about any of the Ukrainian forces you've come into contact with and just your personal impressions of them?
so because you can talk to territorial defense, which, to be clear to your listeners, is like the militia that's been created um, in a very short time period with conscription and a lot of voluntary enlistment as well. The real Ukrainian army, like the 200,000 or so guys that they had before this started, you really can't talk to those guys. You can't photograph them. I mean, twice I've had my phone seized and photos deleted because I took pictures of Ukrainian soldiers or their checkpoints. So as a result of that, I've been reporting on more independent militias or units because they're now all incorporated within the structure of the armed forces, like the Georgian Foreign Legion that I mentioned, because that commander has the autonomy to talk to me. And yeah, this morning I interviewed the founder of the Azov Battalion, Andriy Beletsky, at their base in Kiev, which was a really interesting interview. The Azov Battalion is a sensitive subject because they're so stigmatized in the West. They've been described roundly as a neo-Nazi organization, as a far-right organization, which kind of puts the Western backers of this war in an uncomfortable position when they're basically rooting for the Ukrainians because Azov is front and center. They're some of the most hardcore soldiers out here, high degree of discipline. They've been incorporated into the military as a special operations unit, not just regular infantry, because of their enhanced capabilities, high degree of morale, lots of training, lots of equipment. They look sharp, they look squared away. They talk, like, so they have a very strong military bearing when you talk to
Mm.
these guys. Um, so what can I say about Azov? I think the most important thing to know about them is, well, first of all, about the neo-Nazi thing is totally fair. I mean, they are a radical right-wing organization. That's the reporting is out there. No one, I don't think anybody denies that. At their base that I went to today, they have, it's like in an abandoned Soviet factory on the outskirts of Kiev. They're manufacturing like hedgehogs, like those barriers
Mm-hmm.
that look like big caltrops. They're like sawing lumber to like sawing tree trunks to make lumber. They're manufacturing like huge stacks of Molotov cocktails out there. And you could walk into the big, empty, like freezing cold, like warehouse or factory that they've commandeered as their headquarters. And there's this huge flag hanging in the main hall, which is the wolf's angle, which looks just like the SS symbol. There's like black sun decorations all over the place, like a pagan symbol that's associated with the Nazis. Um, some of that is, I think, taken a little bit out of context because of the complicated history between Ukraine, Germany, and Russia. So the appropriation of Nazi symbols and Nazi symbols and regalia. In some ways, that's like the audience of that is Russia. They're kind of trolling them in a way,
Mm.
because obviously the Russians have a big thing with being anti-Nazi, and they're the great. Russia's whole national identity is built on their defeat of the Nazis in World War II. So for Azov to appropriate that in a way, it's kind of trolling them. It's also like those type of symbols, like those pagan symbols, are a lot more, I would say, appropriate or accepted here in Eastern Europe. So all that being said, they are a white supremacist organization. I mean, so there was a huge thing that when I was leaving the base, I noticed, like, right on this wooden like wall as we were leaving it, it just says white power, just straight up. So like, make no bones about it. Like, that's what Azov is. And Andrei Bieletsky is on the record with a lot of this stuff. They're trying to clean up their image a little bit now because they've been designated as a terrorist organization by the State Department. And they're not eligible to receive military aid from the United States. But that's just the reality of who they are and what they're doing right now. I think because of that, it hasn't really been foregrounded, the fact that Azov is the main force in Mariupol right now.
Yeah, is that the big key here? Because they are. I don't know. It would be, maybe this is a bad comparison, but if there was an invasion and Texas, was getting clobbered, it's like the Texas National Guard. I don't know. It's the home team, right, for Mariupol here. And I don't mean to draw a comparison between the two, but they're the home team, right, for Mariupol, and they're absolutely critical here in the defense or retaking of Mariupol.
I think Azov is a lot more hardcore than the Texas National Guard.
Thank you. Yeah.
But
that's their home turf,
yeah,
right?
It's their home
Mariupol.
turf.
Yeah.
It's on the Sea of Azov.
Yeah.
Which is what they take their name from. But here's the point that I'm building to. Azov is on the point of being destroyed. Like, they're going to die. They may very well die to a man in Azov, in Mariupol. They're completely surrounded. Bieletsky told me that there's no way for them to get aid to them at all, that their water supplies are dwindling. And he said that because of their ethos, they were going to fight to the death. Like, they're not going to surrender. So this Azov battalion that has been in the media and has been talked about so much, they're on the verge of being killed, like, to a man, as I said. There's a little bit of misreporting around this because Azov commanders, including Bieletsky, who left his military post to be a politician some time back and is now back in a military position with Azov, to be clear. Some veterans of Azov are now forming new units around Kiev. Like, when I went to their base, they had recruits everywhere. They're like signing people up. So, and I asked him, well, what do you call that? Because he was criticizing some U.S. outlets for calling some units, there's some units in the area of Bucha that was just liberated that are being called Azov. It's actually different. It's not the original Azov. They're what they call Azov Territorial Defense. So they're on the verge of being destroyed completely, and they're rebuilding themselves kind of from scratch here in Kiev.
In that rebuilding, Seth, are they rebranding too, or are they still embracing, the neo-Nazi elements and the branding? And when you talk to Bieletsky, did he feel like they were getting less support militarily because of this part of their identity, and that some are, if they weren't the Azov battalion, that they might get more outside military support and international support in Mariupol?
That's absolutely the case. He was quite, I would say, bitter that they haven't been able to be directly supplied with javelins and in-laws. Maybe that has something to do with the difficulty they've had in Mariupol. I don't know. That'd be a tactical question, but yeah, he certainly that has hamstrung them. And what can you say about it? The situation, it is what it is. That it is what it is. They are who they are, and that's why they didn't get support. And the Russians are attacking Mariupol not because their primary objective is to supposedly denazify Ukraine. That's just propaganda. But because they want that city, they want that land bridge from Russia to Crimea.
I think this is a fascinating part of this, and a really interesting point too, for a propaganda value standpoint for Putin, as this continues to unfold, because it looks like he may try to make Mariupol his salvaging victory. And if you've got the Azov Battalion in there, it gives him at least the ingredients to be able to tell the story differently to his own people. And I think it's a really important story that you're covering, that we have to watch, especially as we wrestle with extremism back here in the U.S. Let me ask you this, Seth. What do you feel like, you're obviously there, and you're not seeing all of the media back here in the U.S., but you grew up in Texas. Like, the average folks back in Texas, what do you feel like they're missing that you're seeing, that you can uniquely communicate to folks who are tracking on this?
So immersed in it, it's hard to know what exactly folks back home are seeing. I mean, what's like the mainstream like narrative that people are taking away from the situation right now?
I don't know if there is one. Maybe another way to ask you, Seth, because I know it's a hard question, is what do you think is most important? What do you think is most important about what you're seeing, and having the really important context of the other places you've been? What do you think is most important right now?
I'm glad to see one country that invades another sovereign country face plant and look really weak as a result of it. It encourages or it discourages other countries from doing this kind of thing, because what Ukraine has shown is the same lesson that we learned in the Iraq War, which is that when a nuclear armed state invades another country, there's nothing anyone can do about it. No one could do anything about the U.S. International opposition to the Iraq invasion. And no one can do anything about Russia, because, as much as people might like to talk about NATO intervention or that kind of thing, I think the people that are really in power in the United States, they understand the stakes, that's just not acceptable. You just can't do that. And so for Russia to win here would have been a really bad thing for, the future of the 21st century. And it's good to see that, that they're basically, they have a lot of time. They can raise a lot more manpower. They can do conscription. They have a lot of options at this point. But the initial phase of this has led to, I would say, describe it as a Russian failure. And so that's really good. I'm glad to see that happen.
I think faceplant's a really good way of putting it. I know you do a lot of reporting, and I can't have you on and not ask you about something you've been, I think, single-handedly covering back here in the U.S. We mentioned the 82nd Airborne. You've covered a number of suicides and deaths at Fort Bragg, where the 82nd Airborne is from. Can I just ask you, what the fuck is going on at Fort Bragg? And based off your reporting, what can you help folks understand about what's happening back here at Fort Bragg?
It's really ugly situation there, really depressing situation. As I reported, 97 soldiers died, at least 97 soldiers died in 2020 and 2021 at Fort Bragg. Over that same time period, just 4 died overseas. The press officers at Fort Bragg will straight up lie about the number of soldiers who have died there. They lied to me in writing. I have proof of that. A Washington Post reporter recently got in touch with me. I think he was kind of like trying to like low-key fact check me, like he didn't believe my reporting. And the press officers had told them that the number was only 70, which would still be a really high number, far more than like at Fort Bragg. They got the whole chain of command relieved, over 28 deaths there in 2020. And, I showed him that I had like the FOIA to prove it. Like I FOIA'd all of their casualty reports for 2021. I think the number might actually be higher than 97, because I'm still relying on Fort Bragg for the 2020 number. We don't know how many soldiers have died in 2022 in the first 3 months of this year. And the thing to know about Fort Bragg, for your listeners who don't already know this, is it's the home of the Army's most elite divisions, most elite units. It's the home of the Special Forces. It's the home of the whole Airborne Corps. It's the home of JSOC, Joint Special Operations Command, Delta Force. And a lot of these units are involved in what's going on. We've had, in little more than a year, 2 Delta Force soldiers just turn up dead. One of them as a result of a firefight that like no one has been able to explain. It took place in the woods outside of Fort Bragg. It's very mysterious, and I've had sources tell me that that soldier, William Levine, was working for a drug cartel and was involved in trafficking drugs. And I've also heard some. This is rumor. This is not confirmed, but a lot of people that know about this community that knew William Levine personally speculate without offering proof that he may have been killed by members of that community because he was a major liability and had been going around doing crazy things. Anyway, I don't want to get off on too much on the story.
No, this is actually really part of your reporting, and I know you had a piece in Rolling Stone. I think it was last year, and you've been tweeting about this and writing about this and staying on it, which I think is really, really important. And it's another reason why I think combat veteran reporters are so vital, because you can cut through the bullshit in a way that somebody that hasn't been inside may be able to. But just, are you able to draw any conclusions at this point, Seth? Because we've got suicides, we've got homicides, we've got drug use. Is this just the wreckage of 20 years of grinding out the most elite parts of our entire military? Is this just everything coming 100%. Apart at the seams?
100%. That's what it is. You name the factors: suicide, soldier on soldier murders, drug trafficking, and overdose deaths, which the main thing that the military is concealing is that a ton of these soldiers have died from overdose deaths. A lot of, by the way, on social media, a lot of people are like speculating when I post stuff like this, oh, it's like the vaccine or stuff like that. The soldiers are falling out, because that's nonsense. There's nothing like that. It's overdose deaths from fentanyl in particular, a lot of drugs, because cocaine use is really prevalent in the Special Forces. And a lot of coke now is cut with fentanyl. And another big thing is steroid abuse. So I don't want to malign the man, the Delta Force major, who just was recently discovered slumped over the wheel of his car, and like the Army can't say how he died, except that he suffered a heart attack at age 38. Again, a major in Delta Force. That's the most elite military unit in the United States, a member of JSOC. So, and I don't know what happened with him, but he's the 3rd soldier to just drop dead from a heart attack. And I know that steroid abuse and steroid trafficking. There's a soldier on trial right now at Fort Bragg, a Special Forces soldier, for importing steroids from overseas. And a side effect of steroid abuse and steroid use is heart problems. Mm-hmm. So you can die at a very young age from heart problems if you're using a lot of steroids. So it's all related in one way or another, or most of it is related in one way or another to drug use and mental illness. And I think that's not a problem that's confined to the military or just to the Special Forces, but sadly to the U.S. society as a whole. We've seen shocking rises in overdose deaths, especially from fentanyl. Fentanyl under the age of 45, adults between the age of 18 and 45 are like 3 times more likely to die from fentanyl overdose than COVID. And fentanyl overdose is the leading cause of death for people under age 45 in the United States, which let that sink in for a moment. So
we haven't even gotten to child abuse and marital problems and all the other wreckage. I think it's a really important story, because I don't think the country has fully come to grips with the cost of our, forever wars, 20 years of war. And now these are the same guys that may be in Ukraine now, definitely in the surrounding region on standby. We talked about that with Chris Fussell last week, about the types of missions they could be asked to do, if this overflow happens in Ukraine, and maybe even if it doesn't, right? We won't know till years from now how involved they were or weren't in places like Syria and even on the ground now in Ukraine. But I think it's really important reporting, Seth. I'm glad you're doing it. I told you before we hit record, I'm glad you're there. which is a hard thing to say because you're in such a shitty place, but I'm glad you're there because you have this unique perspective and you're such a talented journalist and you got heart, and that comes through in a way that I think is really, really important when you're covering stories like this, and perspective. So maybe let me ask you, man, this is a tough question, but having been to all these places, having been through so much, and now you're there now, any reflections on I don't want to say on life, but like what are you learning about the bigger picture of the world? When it can feel so overflowing and it can feel like there's so much shit happening, you're still out there doing good work and making a difference. You know, you used to be a lawyer and you transitioned and went to become a journalist. And in my view, you're a hero because you're doing the work that we need. So many of these journalists are doing the work we need. What are your big takeaways, man? If you can even start to process it yet.
One thing, it's really concerning because I was thinking this the other day, like it's 2022, in 3 years, we'll have be one quarter done with this century. And that it's my whole adult life. We have seen a lot of armed conflict and a kind of breakdown, I would say, in not that the 20th century wasn't riven by war, but I guess towards the 1990s and early 2000s, things didn't seem to quite point in this direction of so much armed conflict and refugee crises, especially, is a big part of it. And pattern that I've observed everywhere is that wars don't end anymore. And I don't know exactly why that is. The Iraq War never really ended. I mean, even if you're just defining it as U.S. involvement, there's still U.S. special operators all over Iraq. I wouldn't say all over, but they're in the north, they're in Anbar, they're on the Tamf border crossing. And a lot of the militias in Iraq are still involved in fighting Iran's in Iraq. The country fell apart and never got put back together. It's a failed state, frozen conflict, and so is Syria. It's all the same things in Syria. That war never ended, and it looks like it's just going to be frozen forever the way it currently exists now. Another war I've done a lot of reporting on is the drug war in Mexico, which really popped off, around the same time as the Iraq War, or a few years later, 2008, 2010. And that conflict, got a lot of attention in the first few years, and it also never really ended. It just keeps getting worse. And my fear is that the Ukraine war will be the same pattern, be the same dynamic. Like the Russians will fail in their attempt to take Kiev, but they'll continue in the Donbass, they'll continue in Crimea, and the country will just be basically stuck in this state of like perpetual frozen war. Other countries where we see that are Yemen, Libya, Somalia. I mean, the list just goes on. And I don't know why it is that wars don't conclude with treaties anymore, and where like we just can rebuild. But I wish we could find some way to have wars when they're over to actually be over, instead of just sort of ending in these stalemates that we see. And I hope that at least maybe in Ukraine there can be some kind of high level political reconciliation that allows for rebuilding to take place and for people to get on with their lives.
I thank you for that, Seth. I think especially when you consider the generation like you and so many others that only know war, right? That only know post 9/11 and beyond. I think it's a really important way to bring it all back to center. Okay, Seth, tell us about your reporting on the Ukrainian Foreign Legion, if you will. We've had, Gallagher was on, we had Quan Nguyen on. There are a lot of folks that are there, on their way there, going there. You've been digging into this. What are your insights, man?
Well, I talked to Matt, a great guy. He's actually doing something a little bit different, which is training the Ukrainian civilians.
Right.
But as far as the Ukrainian Foreign Legion, which they announced to so much fanfare at the beginning and claimed that they had 20,000 volunteers, I'm sorry to report that it doesn't exist. I've been in search of the Ukrainian Foreign Legion since I got here. There's been a million pieces on them, but they're just interviewing guys who are knocking around Warsaw or Lviv, and who are trying to join up, but are finding themselves frustrated in those efforts. The Ukrainians initially said anyone was welcome to come over, whether you have combat experience or want to gain it. Quickly backtracked on that when a lot of people without any sort of experience showed up. And they now are saying only people with combat experience. There was that missile strike on the Yavory base, which really demoralized the Foreign Legion, or the Foreign Legion volunteers. And I guess about another third of them deserted after that, or didn't desert because they never joined up, but just left. The remainder who are here are basically being warehoused in, like safe houses around Kiev, other places. The Ukrainians are stringing them along with promises of weapons, promises of, body armor, ammunition, but they're not getting any of it. They say it's because they don't have any. That's actually not true. The Ukrainians have plenty of rifles, and they have plenty of ammunition. I got that straight from the Inspector General of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. So why they're not giving them weapons, I think is pretty easy to guess why. I mean, they just don't have the capacity to organize like a battalion of foreigners, because there's the language problem, there's the command and control problem, there's the vetting problem. Like, how do you know these guys aren't Russian spies? Probably a lot of them are Russian spies. That's probably how they figured out exactly where the Yavory base was, and like just dumped a bunch of cruise missiles on top of it. I've
So
been to the
what's your
front line.
message for guys or gals who are thinking about coming over, thinking they're going to be, John Wayne on the front line of this fight?
If you must come over here, volunteer in a humanitarian capacity or in a medical capacity. There is no Kalashnikov waiting for you. There's no body armor waiting for you. You will not be deployed. You may be stuck in a safe house, and they may tell you that you're going to, but it's not going to happen. I was at the front. I talked to soldiers who are there, Ukrainian soldiers who just liberated suburbs of Kiev. Have you seen any Americans around here? Have you seen foreigners taking place in the fight? No. Except for a very small number of special forces, ex-special operations soldiers, who I'm not sure exactly their background or how they got here. Maybe they were part of the special operations efforts before February that were taking place that we know of in Ukraine. And maybe I've heard of one guy who's a Green Beret who was a Ukrainian American. Heard tell of this guy. There are a very few number of highly trained, specialized, freelance ex-SOF guys who are taking place in the fight, but their numbers are very, very low. That the Ukrainian Foreign Legion does not exist.
Hmm. That's big stuff, man. So I hope we'll continue to get your reporting on that, because it does feel like, I can't tell you how many reporters I've had reach out to me and say, hey, can you put me in touch with a couple of vets who are over there? And I'm like, I don't know any right now. And if I did, they're probably not going to fucking talk to you, right? If they're really elite and they're really specialized, they're not going to talk to me. They're not going to talk to you. They're not going to talk to the reporter who emails me who I've never met before. So I think it's a really important story, and I'm glad you're tracking on it, Seth. I hope you can stick around for a couple of quick fire questions for our Patreon members who help us
Absolutely.
keep this show going. But on behalf of all of us, I just want to thank you for being out there, for telling the stories. We're going to continue to share all your writing. What you're doing is courageous and important, and a true public service, to the U.S., but to the world. So thank you for all you're doing out there, man. And thank you for bringing the truth. And when you get back, I owe you a couple drinks, and maybe I'll even buy you a jewel, man. Whatever
Yeah,
you need. When you get back, I'll get you a jewel or two, man.
I'm sure I'll need a new replacement. Thanks very much for saying so, Paul. I really appreciate your kind words, and thanks very much for having me on.
You got it, brother. Stay vigilant.